Hey guys, it's Shara from Woodshop Diaries, and today I'm going to show you how I built this fake fireplace slash console, which is actually a dog crate for my sister's dog. So if you're ready to get building, let's go. Come on. This may look like a fake fireplace or just your typical console cabinet, but I actually made this for my sister's dog. They wanted to give him a hangout spot for his bed, but also wanted to use this as a TV stand and storage console. And if you know my sister, you know that this had to have a lot of fancy trim and time-consuming details. It did take some patience and a lot of unnecessary add-ons because of all of those details, but no pain, no gain, right? I've got the plans in step-by-step tutorial linked below, and I'll show you how it came together here. And by the way, I recently upgraded cameras and this is my first video using it, so bear with me as I'm still figuring out some of its settings. Okay, let's get building. So the first thing I did was start cutting down my plywood. And if you're interested, I have a video about how I cut down my plywood sheets that I will link right up here in the top corner. Okay, so once my plywood was cut down, I began assembling the middle section of this console first. This section was deeper and wider than the side cabinets since it would be the dog crate part of the project. I assembled the sides and bottom together using pocket holes and screws, and once the carcass was together, it was time to add the face frame. I used 1x3s on the side of the face frame and a 1x4 at the bottom, and then assembled using pocket holes and screws. Once the face frame was together, I glued and nailed it onto the front of the middle cabinet section. Now here's where some of those unnecessary details start coming in. I added another 1x3 at the top here on the inside of the face frame. This could have been easier if I had added this as part of the face frame so it was all on the same plane, but my sister wanted the crown molding that goes along the top to wrap around the 1x3s for a little added detail. So once that 1x3 was added, I also added some strips at the top like shown to give me somewhere to attach the top piece later. Now that the main box was together, here's another unnecessary detail that I added. So I basically added a frame inside the frame for the doors to sit inside. Again, this really wasn't necessary, but it just added a little bit more detail and dimension and work. I simply cut to fit and screwed these pieces in place from the inside. I used 1x3s on the sides, a 1x2 at the top, and a 1x4 at the bottom. Now it was time to add the side cabinets. My sister wanted these cabinets to be shallower than the middle section, so I made these about 17 inches deep. And for these sections, there's only one side, a bottom, and some bracing at the top. I assembled it all with pocket holes and screws. Then I flipped the middle section on its side to install the first side cabinet like shown. I made sure that the top support was square before screwing it in place. Then I flipped it over on the other side to install the second side cabinet. Once the sides were attached, I added a face frame to each one by assembling 2 L-shaped face frames with a 1x3 on the side and a 1x4 at the bottom. I glued and nailed these onto the side cabinets like shown. And now more unnecessary details. I glued and nailed some 1x3 blocks at the bottom corners of the middle and side cabinets like shown, and then I cut to fit more 1x3s to go between them. To finish off all the bottom details, I cut to fit cove molding to go along the top edge of all of these pieces. There's a lot of little trim pieces and you can totally skip a lot of this, but my sister wouldn't be happy if I didn't add literally as much trim detail as possible, so that's what I did. Once all the bottom trim was finished, I flipped it back up, took a deep breath, and started on the top trim. You didn't think this was over with yet, did you? So much trim. I cut to fit crown molding along the top like shown, and I used a scrap piece of wood laid on top to make sure that I installed these at the right height so that the top of the crown molding would touch the top panel once I install it later. As a side note, you could add the top first and then add the crown later, but I just did this backwards to make sure that my top would fit and cover all of the crown molding once it was installed. Once the crown was on, it was time to move on to the drawers. I love building drawers, but you know what I don't like about drawers? If you followed me for a while and you've watched a lot of my projects, you may not have noticed, but you may have noticed, I don't know. I don't use face frames, hardly ever, unless the design specifically calls for using face frames. I hate face frames, and the reason why I hate face frames is when you add drawers, you have to add all this structure crap to mount the slides onto, because you can't just mount your slide onto the side of the cabinet because it won't come out because of the face frame. I hate, absolutely loathe having to add this framing crap into a cabinet. I just feel like it's a waste of time and resources, so I just don't like doing it. Unfortunately, I didn't have much choice in this case, so I sucked it up and got to work. To add the framing structure in order to mount the drawer slides, I used some leftover 1x3s and some pocket holes and screws to install kind of a box within a box into the middle cabinet like shown here. I made sure to keep the pieces on the sides where the slides will mount equal distance from the side panel just to make sure that I kept things square. Then I installed a 1x3 at the back of each side cabinet and added 1x3s between the face frame and this piece, spacing them about 12 inches or so, starting at the bottom. Thankfully, I only needed to add this framing to the outside ends because the insides don't have a face frame. So I installed 16-inch ball bearing drawer slides onto the 1x3s and in corresponding locations opposite them. I made sure to keep the fronts of the slides about 1 inch inset from the front edge of the face frame to allow for inset drawers later. As a side note, for the slides that are not mounted onto the framing pieces, it was a little bit difficult to ensure that the spacing is correct for the inset drawer fronts. So I suggest using the horizontal slotted holes on the slides so that once the drawers are installed later, you can use these slots to adjust back and forth as needed. Before I moved on to the drawer boxes, I went ahead and attached the top to make sure that I didn't run out of plywood for it. So I cut a piece of 3/4 inch plywood the total width of the cabinet, including the crown molding, and set it on top. I needed to trim the front corners down to match the shape of the cabinet, so I measured and marked to allow for about a 1/2 inch overhang off the crown molding. I marked this off and put painter's tape along the lines to help prevent splintering from the jigsaw, then I cut along these lines. I applied some glue-on edge banding along the sides and the front of this piece, sanded it smooth, and centered it on the cabinet. I attached it through the top supports of the middle and side cabinets with wood screws from the bottom side. Then I used a few more nails to secure the top edge of the crown to the top panel as well. Now finally, it was time for the fun stuff, building the drawers. I have a detailed tutorial for how I build my drawers on my website that I will link below if you want more details. But I simply cut my pieces from 3/4 inch plywood and then cut a 1/4 inch dado along the bottoms to install the 1/4 inch plywood drawer bottom. Then I assembled them together using pocket holes and screws like shown. I made 6 identical drawers for the side cabinets and then one shorter but wider for the middle cabinet. I used some scrap wood spacer blocks to install these drawers onto the slides. After the drawers were installed onto the cabinet, next up was the drawer fronts, and of course, these had to have some extra detail too. I ripped some 1x4s into 1 inch wide strips, mitered the corners, and cut to fit these around each drawer front like shown. I set up my miter saw to cut 45 degrees to cut each of these pieces individually for a tight fit. And then I glued and nailed these pieces around the edge of the plywood to make the drawer fronts. Once the glue was dry, I brought them over and installed them onto the drawer boxes. So I centered them in place and attached from the inside with wood screws like shown. It was easiest to remove the drawer above it to give me access to the inside. But once I got to the top drawer, I was pretty frustrated and it was blazing hot. So I just cheated and shot a nail in the front to hold it in place so that I could open the drawer and drive the screws. I'm hoping when I add the hardware later that I'll be able to cover the nails. And if not, whoops. I'm also not going to lie to you here. It was extremely difficult to ensure that everything was square on these drawer fronts with these pieces added around the edge. So after they were all installed, I brought out the belt sander and sanded to fit as needed. Don't judge me, I'm just keeping it real. And finally, I could give this some stain and see the light at the end of the tunnel. While the stain dried, I moved on to building the drawers. I made these doors from 1x3s except for the piece at the top. For that, I used a 1x6. I wanted to curve the top and side of these doors, just for more unnecessary detail. So I laid out all the pieces and used a leftover thin piece that I had after I ripped the 1x4s for the drawer fronts to make a nice even bow. But since I was holding the bow, I needed an extra set of hands to trace it out.
Trace what?
Take this pencil and trace on the bottom side of this. Thanks.
Is that good enough?
Yeah, that's good. Once it was traced, then I could cut out the curve with a jigsaw and clean it up with the belt sander. I assembled these doors using dowels and wood glue, but you could also use pocket holes or more fancy joinery if you wanted. Once the glue was dry, I sanded and painted the doors black, and then I measured the inside opening of the doors and found some leftover hardware cloth mesh to cover the holes. I used some wire cutters to trim the cloth to size and then spray painted them black to match the door. Once all of the paint was dry, I stapled the mesh onto the back side of the doors and used some thin leftover scrap to cover the rough edges. Then I used some simple butt hinges to install these into the cabinet. And no fancy build is complete without fancy hardware, so I added this Cremone bolt latch to the door as well. And to keep both doors closed with one latch, I added a little scrap wood block to the back of the door like shown. The final step was some poly and some drawer pulls. And then I remembered I still had to attach the back. So I cut some 1/4 inch plywood to cover the back of the middle cabinet and stapled it in place. And finally, it was finished. This piece required so much of my patience with all of these details, but I have to admit, the details really make it what it is. All in all, I'm really happy with how this turned out, but I'm so ready to get back to clean line builds and no more face frames. If you're into traditional style stuff though, this would really make a nice console or even a fake fireplace too. Don't forget, I've got the plans linked below if you would like to build one for yourself, and I promise I have made them as easy as possible to follow even with all of the details. If you've enjoyed this build, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on what's coming next. Thanks so much for watching, you guys, and until next time, happy building.